By the way, I need one of y'all to confirm this for me. Does Conan Silvera indeed have 2 piranha plant tattoos on his back? Because that's sure as hell what it looks like. Please, contact us. We need to know. Hello everyone and welcome to MMA Start to Finish. I'm Julian and this is Matt.
Howdy.
And today we're going to be talking about UFC Ultimate Japan, which took place in the
Yokohama Arena in Yokohama, Japan. The second largest city in Japan, I think is what they said.
Which, fun fact, apparently this arena was modeled after the Madison Square Garden. Nobody calls it the Madison Square Garden, it's just Madison Square Garden, but you get the point. UFC Ultimate Japan had an attendance of 5,000. Now, the last UFC event, UFC 15, they did not give us any attendance figures as it was held in a casino in St. Louis Bay, Mississippi.
Yeah.
So not exactly accurate attendance numbers. But these are the exact same attendance numbers we had from UFC 14, the last time we had attendance.
Yeah. So, I don't know how things are going to go forward, but in my guess for right now, I'm going to say UFC 15 was the lowest point for the sport outside of starting out the gate. I'm going to say that was probably their lowest point as far as like attendance and feasibility for continuing.
And the money coming in.
Yeah. Because I think that was just like a ticketed event that was in the town. Just like, this is happening. You want in? Buy a ticket.
And I'm sure it's no coincidence that we're seeing this first ever UFC event in Japan the same year we saw the first ever Pride. It was pretty obvious that MMA was exploding in popularity in Japan. We have a new play-by-play commentator. Bruce Beck, as we mentioned in our last show, has called his last fight for the UFC. And now we are treated to the dulcet tones of Mike Goldberg and all his glorious corniness and redundance. It's fun, and we better be fun, because we're going to be having Mike call these fights for quite some time now.
So I've heard. You said that he gets a little repetitive. We do see that tonight. He wasn't, like, awful.
He wasn't
just
bad.
New. I think it's a good way to put it. He's new.
So thankfully, unlike in the past, where we've had to figure out what the new rules were mid-fight, this time they actually laid out nicely for us, the new rules, as you can see if you're watching on YouTube. These weren't all the rules. There was actually 2 slides that they showed us, but the first slide was the older, more established rules, like no biting, no eye gouging, no hair pulling.
Yeah, no fish hooking, that kind of stuff.
Whereas on the second slide, they actually showed us the new rules, new from the last fight anyway. No groin strikes, small joint manipulation. No kicking when man is down, which I'm just now realizing is very weird grammar.
Yeah.
And apparently, no kicking when man is down did not account for no kneeing when man was down, because we saw that quite a bit tonight.
Also, no elbows to the back of the head and neck, and no pressure point strikes. What would that be?
I don't even know what that could mean, honestly.
The only thing I can think of is that one girl from Avatar, and she like punches people in private, like pressure points, and they like can't move their arm anymore.
Like dead arms people?
Yeah.
This makes me, when I see no pressure point strikes, what that makes me think of is those old karate movies where a dude would just like palm strike you in a weird spot in your chest and the dude would die.
Yeah, like they get a heart attack.
Yeah, that kind of thing. That's what it makes me think of. So for UFC Ultimate Japan, we have lined up a heavyweight tournament consisting of 2 rounds, the first ever middleweight championship bout, and the defense of Maurice Smith's heavyweight title against Randy Couture. Also, they called it a super fight. I think that's fairly generous. We have a fight with Joe Charles and Vitor Belfort.
It's been a while since we've seen Joe Charles, the ghetto man.
That is his nickname. That is not Matt being culturally insensitive.
No, he just came up with that on his own.
The first fight we saw tonight was actually the alternate bout for the heavyweight tournament, where we saw Brad Kohler taking on Trey Teligman. Brad was new to the UFC, but we'd actually seen Trey before, as he'd taken on Vitor in the past. Now, immediately upon seeing him, Matt and I noticed that Brad has quite the interesting frame. I believe I wrote, Brad is a brick shithouse.
Yeah. And even the commentary said he was stout.
Very stout. It's a good word for it.
Yeah. He's short. He's got a thick neck. He's big. He's big in a small way.
Big things do come in small packages, after all. Early on in this fight, it was rather apparent that Brad wanted to take things to the ground. He had an early takedown attempt that was unsuccessful, but shortly after that was able to bring Trey to the ground.
Brad ends up getting in a mount, but it's like a really low mount. Like he's not sitting on Trey's waist, but on his knees.
Yeah, he's on his like low to upper thigh area rather than the traditional mount position.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of working, but...
And he did eventually like scoot his way up.
Yeah, he got to a regular mount eventually. And it's at this point where commentary is mentioning for the first time mixed martial arts as like a thing.
Yeah, as the name for the sport we're watching. Previously, they'd called it reality combat or no-holds-barred combat, reality fighting.
Or cross-training. Yeah,
all those names suck dick, so we kind of needed a little bit more of
some more pizzazz in the term.
Yeah, exactly. So this is I mean, we could be wrong. They've said in the past mixing the martial arts. They've used that phraseology, but I think this is the first time at least we've noticed that they've actually referred to the sport that way.
Yeah, or like mixed fighting styles, something. But yeah, like you said, this is the first time we've noticed them purposefully using mixed martial arts as a term.
So despite Brad getting mount and controlling the position fairly well, he didn't do a lot from that position. So again, we see in the 90s, they don't care at all about standing you up from mount. An advantageous position, what? I didn't see you doing shit. So yeah, Brad had mount, Big John stood him up.
It wasn't Big John.
You're right, it wasn't Big John. This is the alternate referee, Joey.
Yeah.
So he gets stood up, but he then gets Trey down again and gets into side control, but it's basically just the same story again where they wind up getting stood up.
Like they were still for a little bit for that first stand up, but for the second one they were kind of actively working and then they got stood up.
Yeah, it's weird because we, of course, have now modern fights to compare this to, so it looks really egregious to us, obviously, with the modern eye.
Yeah.
But you didn't hear commentary or even the crowd, who seemed pretty informed, react too negatively to those stand-ups.
Yeah.
How'd you feel about it? Did you feel like they were warranted?
I think the first one was a little surprising, but it was not horrible. The second one felt way too early.
I would tend to agree.
At this point, Trey started realizing that these shots were going to keep on coming, so he got better at defending against them. They ended up in a bit of a scramble, and Trey actually manages to snake out Brad's arm, takes it to the bar, and makes Brad tap.
So yeah, Trey wins in a fight that up until that point he had been, I would say, losing. If the fight had just proceeded as it had been going, with Brad controlling the position in mount and side control, the judge would probably give him that result.
Yeah.
After this armbar, Trey would be very excited at the prospect of continuing potentially in the tournament, especially with how often we've seen, main tournament entries fall through with injury. Considering he was able to finish this fight without taking too much damage, he had to feel pretty good about his chances had he been called on later in the night.
Yeah, it was mostly a ground game kind of fight, so it wasn't like he was taking a whole lot of heavy blows.
And it wasn't like he was throwing too many strikes or he might hurt his hand, which we see a lot. In the first fight of the heavyweight tournament for the night, we have ANJO taking on the returning Tank Abbott. Fun fact about these guys before we get into the fight, they mentioned on commentary that several days earlier, or I don't know how much time earlier, but they'd mentioned prior to this fight, some of Tank's training partners at his gym took on some of Yoji's training partners in a different promotion, and that in those fights, Yoji's partners got the better of Tank's.
Yeah, so it kind of sets like a little tension before the fight.
A little bit of lore.
Yeah. So Tank's got to avenge his team before this fight, or in this fight.
So early on in this fight, almost immediately, Tank shoots in for a takedown, and goes to his usual bag of tricks where he takes you down, stacks you up against the fence, and then tries to destroy the architecture for some reason.
Yeah.
He was seriously just shoving dude's head into the fence to the point where half of his hair was just peeking out of the cage.
Yeah, it gets a little ridiculous.
And if you could see here on YouTube, the fence gets broken.
Yeah.
And by this point, we don't have these ragtag bullshit cages we had back in 1994. No. These are pretty okay, decent cages. And even with that, Tank is still able to open this can up.
Yeah. Though, through this, he is also holding onto the fence quite a bit, and Big John doesn't really seem to take notice.
Yeah, it seems like when there's already a guy on the ground and it's more of a subtle grab where your hand's near his head and it looks like you could be controlling his head, they're not as hip to that quite yet. You don't really see that nowadays, of course, because they're pretty on to the cage grabbing and it would get immediately shouted at by everybody in the building.
Yeah.
But back then, you could bend the rules a little bit.
So, before Yoji's head completely escapes the octagon, John stands them up. Even though they're still fighting, I don't think he would have stood them up just because Yoji's head is getting out of the cage until it was, like, out of the cage.
Yeah, this stand-up struck me as much stranger than the stand-ups we saw in the fight before, especially because not only was one of the guys working, but both of them were working. Tank was trying to work his ground and pound, and while even on his back, Yoji framed up for some armbar attempts and some triangle attempts, trying to do something. So it struck me as very weird that they decided to stand him up.
Yeah. They even went back down to the ground again, back on the fence, and got stood up again. At this point, Yoji decided, I'm going to try and keep him away from me, so he doesn't pin my head up against the cage to the point where my hair is more out of the octagon than it is in the octagon. But they don't do enough to really stop Tank. They're not as strong as the leg kicks he's received by Maurice. So ends up taking Yoji to the floor again before we end up in overtime.
Yeah, this fight was basically the same story repeated over and over again, where Yoji looked okay on the feet, threw some pretty crisp leg kicks, but was swiftly taken down by Tank and just pounded up against the cage. Not enough for the fight to get stopped, but enough for when this fight eventually did go to decision, it would go Tank's way.
In this decision, by the way, we found out that one of the judges is the referee for the alternate fight.
Which I was saying to Matt during the fights actually makes a whole hell of a lot of sense. And in the modern day, I'd actually way rather have referees be judging these fights than, not to be rude, the clowns we have who sometimes bung up these decisions. I feel like a referee would be far more equipped to determine who won a fight, given that their entire job is managing the safety of a fight.
The one thing I could see going against that is sometimes fighters get a little, I guess, I don't know if this is the right word, but braggadocious, a little full of themselves and kind of check referees, not like a whole lot, but they'll bump into them, push
well, I guess
them
it does
aside.
create some like undue animosity between the fighters and the refs. Now that I think
Yeah.
through this a little more, it would get a little weird to have a guy reffing your fight who 3 months ago judged your fight.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's some baggage there maybe you don't want to bring with you. After Tank won this fight by decision, he mentioned briefly that he had injured his hand, and we would later find out that it wasn't just a bruise, Tank broke his hand,
Yeah.
and would be unable to continue in the tournament.
We also had Metallica playing in this interview.
Yeah, we should note, and we mentioned this on Wikipedia, this is the first time they actually had fighters walk out to custom entrance music, which we didn't hear because, I don't know if you noticed, but I noticed this was a heavily edited telecast as compared to the ones we've been watching.
Yeah.
So they cut out the intros and the entrance music, but during the post-fight interviews, whoever was running the PA system said, fuck your interview, never turned down that music, so we just had late 90s era Metallica blaring in the background of most of these interviews, which I don't mind. I think it was kind of fun.
I don't mind it either. I just kind of wish we could hear the interviews a little better.
Yeah. Certainly better than the generic, I don't even want to call it butt rock. It's just garbage that we've been getting before. In the second leg of the tournament, we would have Conan Silvera taking on Kazushi Sakuraba. And do not let this tale of the tape deceive you. Sakuraba was a little dishonest with UFC promoters in the lead up to this fight, apparently, according to his Wikipedia entry.
Only like a small dog's worth of lie.
So apparently, one of Sakuraba's stablemates was to enter in this heavyweight tournament. Someone presumably on the same size level as Conan, you know, a large boy. Sakuraba is clearly a much leaner man, and apparently, despite him lying to UFC officials telling them he weighed 203 pounds, Sakuraba apparently only weighed 183 pounds. So, well under the heavyweight limit.
It kind of showed he just has a smaller frame. He doesn't look the size that he advertises.
Early on, this fight was pretty interesting. There was a cool grappling exchange between the two guys, where both of them looked like they were angling for some leg locks, with Sakuraba on top and Conan underneath of him. I couldn't really tell if any of those were close to being sunk in, but it was cool to see them play that game.
So, officially, this is a pretty short fight, even though it's a draw? Officially.
Officially, it is a no contest, which is slightly different than a draw. But don't worry with the phraseology on this one. This is a weird fucking fight.
Well, because Bruce, when he was announcing this, said it was a draw.
Oh, he did?
Yeah. So either Bruce got it wrong or they changed it post-fact.
Well, this is definitely an example of them just making shit up as they go.
Yeah.
This certainly was not planned out ahead of time.
So
We're kind of burying the lead here.
yeah. Conan has Kazushi up against the fence, not like holding him there, but is just punching at him. But none of these really connect except for one or two.
Most of them landed on the arms.
It's pretty much a flurry of fists going to Kazushi, and he admittedly isn't defending himself very intelligently. He mostly just has his arms up, and Big John is watching, and he's expecting something to land and to drop Kazushi. Kazushi does drop, but he's trying to shoot for Conan. Big John does not realize that and stops the fight.
And here we would have one of the most infamous stoppages in MMA history. Now, of course, Big John is regarded as one of the greatest refs of all time, the gold standard, the dude who basically invented this shit as far as officiating goes. But this is his most notable bung-up of all time, stopping this fight when Sakuraba was very obviously going in for a takedown attempt. Now, he thought that when he fell to his knees, he had been knocked out by Conan. Which, I understand where John's coming from. Like, Sakuraba is the smaller guy, and Conan was kind of just teeing off on him. But immediately after the stoppage, you could tell that it was a mistake.
Yeah.
And Sakuraba's corner was, Sakuraba and his corner were not exactly understanding about the way things played out.
So after they announced that Conan was the winner by TKO, I think they had it
They
as.
said knockout,
They
which
just
was
plain
bold
knockout?
to fucking say.
Oh boy. Kazushi then attempted to grab the mic from Bruce. Bruce was having none of that.
Bruce looked pissed off. He looked at him like, what the fuck are you trying to pull here, buddy?
Yeah.
Absolutely no way I'm going to hand you my microphone.
Yeah. And after that was announced, Conan was attempting to leave but also shake hands.
Trying to be honorable, because I'm sure
Yeah.
he also realizes that this stoppage was kind of nonsense, and it's not his fault.
Yeah, Kazushi did shake hands and then proceeded to throw his mouthpiece on the ground, screaming. But Kazushi's team actively avoided a handshake with Conan.
He walked up to them and, like, gestured like he'd shake their hand, and dude pulled his hand away, like, you're not fucking shaking my hand, mister.
Yeah. A misplaced anger, I think is a good way to put that.
Now, if you thought this stoppage was weird, things certainly don't get any more normal after the fight. So with Tank out with an injured hand, you would assume that Trey would fill in his stead and take on Conan despite the inauspicious result in the finals. But UFC brass would decide to just make shit up as they go and decided to overturn the result and called it an early stoppage, which, to my knowledge, this is the only time something like this has ever happened. And they had them rematch in the finals. So the finals was literally a rematch of one of the first fights in the tournament. Super weird.
Yeah.
Super weird.
Basically like, oh, you guys fought? Well, do it again. I understand them wanting to do a rematch, but not within the same night for the medal.
Yeah, and also you kind of got a feel for Trey a little bit here. He fought a grueling victory against his opponent, got an armbar submission, and with Tank out, you had to assume Trey was going to come in to fight the winner. But no, he just got well, as you have in your notes.
He got cucked.
I think that's a fair word
Yeah.
for this setting.
He got screwed over for this. No mention of that gets
Yeah, they
put
didn't
around.
even bring that up on commentary. Like, oh, by the way, Trey Telligman can go fuck himself.
Yeah.
They didn't say a word about it. They pretended like that alternate fight didn't even happen.
Nothing on Wikipedia mentioned it, that like Trey's team was even upset. We just don't know their feelings on it. I assume that they're unhappy, or at least they were at the time. But
No formal documentation of such anger.
yeah, it's weird. This is weird.
It's a shit show.
Yeah.
It's a shit show. Before we would move into our next fight, where the middleweight championship would be contested for the first time in UFC history, we were treated to a montage of Frank Shamrock from his fights in Pancrase. And it was kind of a nuts montage. He was, a lot of the footage they showed was him fighting Bas Rutten in Pancrase, and two notable insane things happened in that highlight reel.
The first one of those is him and Bas Rutten just flying out of the ring. Like, completely.
Yeah, I'm not sure which one of them went for the takedown. I think it was Frank, but given that they were fighting in a ring instead of a cage, and then got backed up to those ropes, there was no safety. They just went flying out, and I'm actually surprised they didn't get hurt, and that the fight wasn't stopped.
Yeah, because it's got to be like a concrete floor. And then the second one was, there's no closed fist striking in Pancrase, so Frank just wanted Bas Rutten to punch him. And
goad him into a foul.
Yeah, and this is his attempt to do so, just openly mocking and making faces at Bas Rutten.
There was like 4 or 5 palm strikes Boss landed, and each time Frank made an increasingly more ridiculous face in response.
Yeah.
We actually did some digging on Wikipedia, and apparently Frank was successful in goading Boss into a foul, because after the 5th time he stuck his tongue out at him like a 5-year-old, he punched him in the mouth, which is a no-no in Pancrase. Frank would take on former middleweight tournament winner Kevin Jackson for the first ever middleweight championship. Both these guys have a fairly similar background as far as their strong suits. Kevin was an Olympic wrestler, so he's a grappler. Coming from Pancrase, Frank also, of course, is well-versed in grappling, so you sort of expected to see this go to the ground early. And it did.
It was early, yeah.
And that was really it.
Kevin went for a takedown, and Frank capitalized on that, took his arm, and put it in the bar. And that was it. It was 22 seconds. It probably wasn't even that, really.
Yeah, we were talking that didn't feel like 22 seconds. That felt much shorter.
It felt like 12 seconds.
But regardless, in near record time, Frank Shamrock would become the first ever middleweight champion in UFC history. It's also important to note, for those of you that are unaware, this isn't the middleweight title we see now. While the heavyweight title that Maurice and Randy are fighting over later is the heavyweight title as we know it today, this is actually the light heavyweight title. So this is the title that John Jones holds today. Up next, we would have the pseudo super fight, Vitor Belfort taking on Joe Charles. Now, this is not the first time we've seen Joe Charles. We've seen him in the past, but it's been a couple years since we've seen him. And in that time, Joe Charles has been traveling around the world in 80 days, visiting all corners of the globe, from Brazil to Japan to Hawaii to Moscow to Birmingham to Tel Aviv. The Globetrotter, Joe Charles.
Yeah, he's everywhere. By the looks of it, though, he's not exactly winning a whole lot, but he's got to be getting paid.
Hey, as long as those checks still clear.
Yeah.
The reason I called it a pseudo super fight, not to be rude to Joe, was because these guys aren't exactly on the same caliber. Not that Joe is bad, but Vitor is clearly one of the more elite athletes and one of the more complete fighters in the UFC. So them calling it a super fight with Joe Charles kind of got me to raise my eyebrows a little bit. Had they just presented it as like, oh, we also have this scheduled fight, I would have been a little less skeptical about their marketing.
So you'd say this is a pseudo Vale Tudo versus Judo fight?
I would if I wanted to rhyme for no damn reason at all.
Yeah. So Vitor seemed to decide he didn't want to strike in this fight. He didn't say so beforehand, but he just showed that he wasn't going to. He quickly takes Joe down to the ground after he gets into the fence, and then just kind of winds around like a clock in different positions around Joe.
Yeah, he went through the whole array. Mount, side control, half guard, he had his back, all over the place. And like Matt said, at no point during these dominant positions did Vitor throw so much as one punch. He wanted to make abundantly clear that he had the grappling skills to go along with his fists.
Joe wasn't like just staying on the ground either. He was trying to get a leg lock. He tried standing guillotine at one point when they were back on their feet, but nothing was really working.
And eventually, Vitor would capitalize on his dominant position, and from mount, transition into another armbar. A lot of armbars tonight.
Yeah, it seems to be the winning move tonight.
And Vitor would be successful in what I had somewhat jokingly called his tune-up fight.
Yeah. Vitor is the victor.
Also, after the fight, Vitor told us that apparently he was sick, and that he was still sick. And if I'm Joe Charles, I should hope that shit's not contagious, motherfucker. You got in the cage and sweat on me.
And this makes me think, like, was part of this, like, he doesn't want to strike to show that he can dominate on the ground, or is it just like, he's feeling kind of sick, so I'm not going to bother striking. I'll just take him out with my judo.
Well, the thing that I found to be weird about that would be, I don't imagine you exert less energy by grappling. As a matter of fact, I think you exert more energy from wrestling a dude around.
Maybe it's like his reaction time is a little slower when he's sick.
I could see that. That would make sense.
And so he's just like, I'll go back to basics for this. No, we did not mess up in editing. They're just fighting again.
The rematch, moments later.
Yeah. So, we have, again, Conan Silvera versus Kazushi Sakuraba. It's literally the same slide from before.
Yeah, we just tabbed back. We didn't take another slide.
Yeah. They did show it again, but, like, what's the point? Conan takes Kazushi to the fence and then to the ground. Kazushi tries for a key lock on Conan, but Conan just gets his wiggle out and gets out of it.
Yeah, not a lot of leverage from his back for Sakuraba to really get an effective arm lock off, but a good way to defend against the onslaught of the much larger man. In reality, the man with almost 60 pounds on him. So after an ill-fated guillotine attempt by Silvera, Sakuraba would actually take him down, and from that position would proceed to close the show with a different arm lock. Not a key lock, but you guessed it, another straight armbar.
The favorite dish of tonight.
So in the rematch, Sakuraba would reign supreme, much to the delight of the Japanese fans and his previously angry corner, who we caught throwing him up in the air like we were watching a Disney film and they were celebrating the protagonist.
Yep. Yoji even entered the ring and started cheering along with him. The entire the auditorium as a whole pretty much was cheering at this moment.
And it's so weird, because this fight, by all senses of logic, shouldn't just not have happened again.
Yeah.
Like, this makes no sense. But honestly, in terms of entertainment and quality standpoint, I'm kind of glad they did it again, because this fight was a little bit more, not only definitive, but I think more interesting than the first go-around.
Yeah.
I also wonder what adjustments they made from fight to fight, because I'm sure after having actually fought each other, they didn't both go in with the same exact strategy the second time.
I also noticed that the press for this event, this was like their big moment. All of the photographers flooded in there and was taking pictures of Kazushi. Didn't see that for the later larger title fights. Didn't
Yeah.
see that for earlier. I think they were just waiting for a Japanese win.
By the way, I need one of y'all to confirm this for me. Does Conan Silvera indeed have 2 piranha plant tattoos on his back? Because that's sure as hell what it looks like. Please contact us. We need to know.
They do look kind of stylized, but they do look like piranha plants on his back.
And as I'm looking at it here, it is a little bit blurry because Sakuraba's extending that arm, but it looks like he has the Misfits Crimson Ghost on his lower forearm as well. And now it is time for the main event of the evening. Maurice Smith defending his heavyweight championship against Randy Couture. A clear clash of styles, but on the tail of the tape, all things are almost even. About the same height, 1 inch difference, literally the same weight, 2 years apart in age. So very similar men, aside from their style of combat.
Yeah. And even that said, Maurice Smith has been training with the Lion's Den, so he's not totally unprepared.
He'd been training with Frank, who was at that point the middleweight champion.
Yeah, he won in 22 seconds. An important note for this, these days, we have people trying to make a weight, so on one day they're the weight they say they are, and then they rehydrate and they're whatever weight they somewhat normally are. At this point, they don't have to make weight. This is just what they weigh.
So they actually are about the same size.
Yeah.
What we were looking for in this fight was whether or not Randy would be able to take Maurice to the ground. Obviously, Maurice was going to prefer to keep this on the feet and sort of chew Randy up the same way he did to Mark Coleman at the end of their fight and the same way he chewed up Tank Abbott in their fight. And early on, things actually looked somewhat promising for Maurice. He managed distance pretty effectively with a few leg kicks. He threw a nice jab in there. But after that pretty good distance control, after a couple seconds, a minute or so, Randy would yank him down to the mat, and the story of this fight would begin to play out.
This story, similar to the Vitor versus Joe fight, Randy ends up going through an assortment of different positions on the ground. He starts in side control, goes to mount, gets side control, half guard, guard. He's all over the place.
And to this point, he hadn't done a ton with those positions, but around the 10-minute mark, he started to throw in some pretty mean hammer fists that didn't close the fight, but certainly swayed it from just a positional advantage to an actual damage advantage.
Yeah. He even threw in some elbows that landed.
During their grappling exchange on the ground, as both men were exerting a lot of energy, Jeff said something real weird on commentary that I guess was okay to say in 1997. I want to give dude benefit of the doubt and say that he slipped up and meant to say a different word. But even to this point, I still can't figure out what else he would have said. And these are his words, not ours. In reference to the endurance of both these guys, Jeff Blatnick said, "I don't think either of these guys are gonna fag out."
Yeah. And we listened back to this
like 3 or 4 times.
I was going to say 4 or 5 times. It is definitely those words.
And I guess that wouldn't, cause too many people to blink in 1997.
It wouldn't cause me to blink in like 2011. I don't necessarily...
I mean, we Googled this afterward to see if there was some, anybody had written an angry blog post about this years later, and we couldn't really find anything about it, but me and Matt both just looked at each other like, did he just fucking say that?
Yeah. Back then, it's kind of par for the course.
Yeah, I'm certainly, and I have to say this because we're on the internet, I'm not asserting that Jeff's some terrible piece of shit human being for this.
Yeah.
It's, unfortunately a slur that people just tossed around back then.
Yeah.
But listening to this in 2019, it does certainly cause you to go, whoa, what the fuck, dude?
For most of the first overtime, it was pretty much just Randy had side control over Maurice, and that was kind of it. He took him down, got to side control, and stayed there.
It was basically just what played out during most of regulation time. Mostly positional control, some strikes getting in there. It wasn't until the second overtime period where we actually started to see some damage come in from Randy, as he would place himself in a north-south position, and while you weren't allowed to kick a downed opponent, once again, not a ton of nuance in here, they didn't say shit about knees, so Randy proceeded to knee Maurice in the head several times from the north-south position. Again, none of them enough to call for Big John to step in, to call for... It didn't even really cut Maurice. It didn't seem like they were super, super powerful knees.
Yeah.
But again, when there's not a ton going on, that's something that's going to stick with the judges.
Yeah. These rules aren't super tight and specific yet, so it does allow for loopholes like, I can knee you to the top of the head. You're not allowed to kick in the back of the head. You're not allowed to knee in the back of the head. But you can knee to the top of the head. That is a very fragile area.
That's a very dangerous thing to do to somebody, because not only can you obviously give them a concussion and damage their skull,
Yeah.
but just the way that compression works, you could fuck with their neck and their spine by like compressing that in like that.
Oh, yeah.
I'll just put it this way. I'm glad you're not allowed to do that anymore.
From there, he goes into like a very odd high side control, then to a normal side control, and they run out the clock.
So once again, we'd have to go to the judges' scorecards for this, and I had expected it to just be a unanimous decision for Randy, because outside of the first couple seconds and outside of the first brief moments after they'd been stood up at any point, Maurice didn't really get a ton of offense off, and while Randy at no point was close to finishing Maurice, just from a positional standpoint and even a minor damage standpoint, you'd think you'd have to give him the fight. But when Bruce went to announce the results, the first judge actually had this as a draw, which I really don't even know how they did that, because nowadays the way you'd get a draw, and let's just say a 3-round fight, would be, let's say fighter A wins round 1 10-8, nearly stops fighter B. But then fighter B wins rounds 2 and 3 10-9. And then the fight would end 28-28, and that's how you'd get a modern draw. But back then, not only were there no rounds, but there was no point system for scoring.
It was just like who you thought won.
Yeah, so I guess the judge was just like, I can't pick, bro. Nothing here.
They both did good. So this wasn't a split decision. It wasn't a unanimous decision. It was
a majority decision.
Yeah.
Because the other two judges did actually score the fight for Randy. So we would have a new UFC heavyweight champion once again, Randy Couture, taking the title away from Maurice Smith. And Maurice sounded a little bit displeased during his interview. He voiced that he didn't really feel like Randy did a ton of damage to him, but he also acknowledged that just from a positioning standpoint, he was routed. And then he also, I don't know if you noticed this, but he did slip in like a little gripe about the sport, about how this sport favors grapplers or something.
I mean, it does.
I mean, it does if you can't stop them from taking you down. Up next on MMA Start to Finish, we will be covering UFC 16, Battle in the Bayou. So, until then, thanks for listening, guys. If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to hit the like button and leave a comment letting us know what you thought of the fights. And we'll see you next time.
Bye. We love you.